The cliff face jutted out like a broken bone over the Pacific, 300 feet of crumbling sandstone that had claimed 2 houses already. Everyone said it was suicide to build there. Sarah Chen knew they were right, but she had no choice. 6 months pregnant and blacklisted from every architecture firm in California, Sarah stared at the impossible lot she'd bought with her last savings. The real estate agent had called her crazy. The city inspector laughed at her permit application. Even her own husband had walked out when she refused to give up. But they didn't know what Sarah knew. Before the whistleblowing scandal destroyed her career, she'd been the youngest structural engineer to graduate MIT. She'd designed earthquake-proof skyscrapers and bridges that defied physics. She'd spent years studying ancient building techniques that modern engineering had forgotten. Now, with creditors circling and her baby due in 3 months, Sarah had one last chance to prove she belonged in the field she loved. The cliff wouldn't defeat her, neither would the mysterious accidents plaguing her construction site or the threatening notes someone kept leaving in her trailer. But what if the real danger wasn't the unstable ground beneath her feet? The wind whipped her dark hair across her face as she stood at the edge, measuring the lot with her eyes for the 100th time. 42 feet wide, 87 feet deep, sloping at a treacherous 30-degree angle toward the churning surf below. The previous structures had been built using conventional methods, deep foundations, standard framing, all the textbook approaches that ignored the cliff's unstable nature. Sarah's approach would be different, revolutionary even. She pulled the rolled blueprints from under her arm, weighing them down with chunks of sandstone as the Pacific breeze tried to steal her life's work. The design looked impossible on paper, a cantilevered structure that seemed to float above the cliff face, its weight distributed through a network of precisely calculated stress points that worked with the rock formation instead of against it. Admiring your future gravesite? Sarah turned to find Marcus Holbrook climbing the dirt path behind her. The developer's silver hair was perfectly styled despite the wind, his expensive suit somehow remaining pristine even in the coastal elements. He'd been circling like a vulture ever since she'd bought the land, making increasingly generous offers to take it off her hands. "The offer still stands," Marcus continued, his smile predatory. "Triple what you paid. Cash. You could disappear somewhere nice, start fresh. Think about your baby." "I am thinking about my baby." Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her rounded belly. "This house will be my legacy to her, proof that the impossible is just another engineering problem waiting to be solved." Marcus's expression darkened. "Sarah, you're playing with forces beyond your understanding. This cliff has a history. The geology reports are 40 years old and based on outdated surveying methods." Sarah began rolling up her blueprints, her movements sharp with irritation. "I've done my own analysis. The substrate is more stable than anyone realizes if you know how to read the signs." "The signs?" Marcus stepped closer, and Sarah caught the scent of his cologne mixed with something else. Fear. What signs would those be? She almost told him about the crystalline formations she'd discovered deep in the cliff face, evidence of an ancient lava flow that had created pockets of incredibly strong volcanic glass. Almost mentioned the indigenous building techniques she'd researched, ways of anchoring structures that European engineering had dismissed as primitive, but were actually sophisticated beyond modern comprehension. Instead, she simply said, "The kind that most people miss." Marcus studied her face for a long moment. Behind them, the surf crashed against the rocks with unusual violence, as if the ocean itself was agitated. "I hope you know what you're doing, Sarah. For everyone's sake." As he walked away, Sarah noticed something white fluttering against a piece of rebar near her trailer. Another note. She'd found 3 in the past week, each one more explicit in its warnings. This one was different, though. Heavier paper, expensive ink. "Some cliffs are meant to fall," it read. "Stop digging before you uncover what was meant to stay buried." Sarah crumpled the note, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from rage. Someone was trying to scare her off her own land, and she had a growing suspicion about who was behind it. The timing was too convenient. Every mysterious accident, every threatening message coincided with Marcus's increasingly desperate offers to buy her out. But why? What was so important about this particular cliff that someone would go to such lengths to keep her from building here? She looked down at her blueprints again, then at the cliff face where she planned to sink her first anchoring points. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. She'd ordered specialized drilling equipment and hired a small crew of contractors willing to work for someone the industry had labeled radioactive. If someone wanted to stop her, they were running out of time. The baby kicked against her ribs as if in agreement, and Sarah smiled grimly. Her daughter would be born into a world where the impossible had a beautiful, defiant home perched above the Pacific. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Sarah Chen kept wrapping her fingers around the ceramic mug anyway, as if the phantom warmth might somehow anchor her to reality. The silence of her empty apartment pressed against her like a physical weight, broken only by the relentless tick of the wall clock that seemed to mock each passing second of her unemployment. 3 months. 3 months since the Meridian Tower hearing, since she'd watched the faces of the construction board cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally cold dismissal. 3 months since David Walsh had looked her straight in the eye and called her accusations the desperate fantasies of a disgruntled employee seeking attention. The stack of rejection letters on her kitchen table had grown thick enough to use as a coaster. Architecture firms, construction companies, even municipal planning departments. Word had spread through the industry like wildfire. Sarah Chen was toxic. Sarah Chen couldn't be trusted. Sarah Chen saw problems where none existed. Her laptop chimed with another email, and she felt that familiar twist in her stomach. Another rejection, probably. But when she opened it, the sender made her pause. Harrison Blackwood. She knew the name, of course. Everyone in architecture did. Blackwood was old money, the kind that had been building monuments to itself for generations. His projects were legendary, impossible structures that defied conventional wisdom and somehow managed to stand for decades. He was also notoriously reclusive, hadn't taken on new work in years. "Miss Chen," the message began, "I have need of someone with your particular combination of skills and circumstances if you're interested in discussing a project that the architectural establishment would consider impossible. Meet me tomorrow at 2 p.m. Café Luna on Pier 47. Sarah read it 3 times before the words fully sank in. Someone wanted to hire her, actually hire her, not just send her a form letter explaining why they couldn't take the risk. The next afternoon found her sitting at a corner table in the weathered cafe, salt air mixing with the aroma of fresh bread. Harrison Blackwood was nothing like she'd expected. Instead of the imposing figure she'd imagined, he was slight and elderly, with intelligent grey eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of her appearance. "You look tired," he said without preamble as he settled across from her. "I am tired," Sarah replied, surprised by her own honesty. "Tired of being treated like a pariah for doing the right thing." Blackwood nodded slowly. The Meridian Tower investigation was concluded rather quickly, wasn't it? Structural concerns dismissed, your calculations deemed overly conservative. Curious how the board managed to reach that determination without actually addressing the foundation issues you raised. Sarah's pulse quickened. "You've read the reports?" "I make it my business to follow cases involving structural integrity, especially when the whistleblower is someone with your track record." He pulled a tablet from his briefcase, sliding it across the table. "Tell me what you see." The screen showed an aerial photograph of a dramatic coastline. Sheer cliffs dropped into churning waters below, and perched impossibly close to the edge sat a narrow strip of land barely wide enough for a building foundation. "It's beautiful," Sarah said carefully. "Also completely unbuildable. The erosion patterns alone would make any structure there temporary at best. And yet I need a house there. Not just any house. Something that will last. Something that will prove a point." Blackwood's eyes glinted with something that might have been mischief or determination. Every engineer I've consulted says it can't be done. The geology is too unstable, the weather too harsh, the risk too great. Sarah studied the image more closely, her architect's eye automatically calculating angles and stress points. Why there? Why not somewhere more feasible? Because feasible won't make the statement I need to make. Because safe won't honor the memory of someone who deserved better. His voice carried an edge of old pain. And because you, Miss Chen, understand what it means to stand by your principles even when everyone else says you're wrong. The implication hung between them. This wasn't just about building a house, it was about proving something. About redemption, maybe, or revenge. Sarah found herself leaning forward, despite every rational instinct telling her to walk away. What makes you think I can do what your other engineers couldn't? Because they're afraid of failure, afraid of lawsuits, afraid of their reputations, afraid of taking risks that might not pay off. Blackwood reached across the table and tapped the tablet screen. You've already lost everything they're afraid of losing. That makes you dangerous. It also makes you exactly what this project needs. Sarah looked at the cliff face again, her mind already beginning to work through the impossible logistics. It would require innovative foundation techniques, probably something involving deep pilings anchored into bedrock. The design would have to work with the natural forces rather than fighting them. It was insane. It was probably impossible. It was exactly the kind of challenge that had drawn her to architecture in the first place. What's the timeline? She heard herself ask. Blackwood smiled. The morning fog clung to the cliff face like a shroud as Sarah pulled her rental car into the gravel clearing that would serve as her construction staging area. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly below, its waves crashing against jagged rocks with a violence that made her stomach clench. She'd reviewed the geological surveys a dozen times during the sleepless flight from Chicago, but seeing the site in person made the impossibility of her task crystal clear. The cliff dropped nearly 200 feet in a series of weathered sandstone shelves, each one seemingly more unstable than the last. Her building site sat on a narrow ledge 30 feet down, accessible only by a treacherous switchback path that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. The previous owner had been an eccentric tech billionaire who'd abandoned the project after 3 engineers declared it structurally unsound. Sarah shouldered her equipment bag and started down the path, testing each step before committing her full weight. Loose stones skittered away beneath her boots, disappearing into the void below. The morning wind carried salt spray and the cries of seabirds, but underneath it all was something else, the faint sound of machinery. She paused, listening. The noise seemed to come from somewhere below her intended building site. Another construction project? The real estate agent had assured her this stretch of coastline was completely isolated. The path curved around a massive boulder, and suddenly she could see the narrow ledge that would become her foundation. Someone had spray-painted a message across the flat rock surface in bold red letters. Death trap. Leave now. Sarah's pulse quickened. She pulled out her phone to document the vandalism, but the screen showed no signal. Of course, she'd known communication would be spotty out here, but she'd planned to install a satellite link within the first week. A shower of pebbles cascaded from above. Sarah looked up to see a figure silhouetted against the sky, too far away to make out details but clearly watching her. When she raised her hand to wave, the person stepped back and vanished. She spent the next 2 hours surveying the site, taking measurements and soil samples while trying to ignore the growing unease in her chest. The geology was even worse than the reports indicated. The sandstone showed clear signs of erosion, with hairline fractures running through what should be her primary anchor points. Any conventional foundation would fail within months. But Sarah hadn't survived 12 years as a structural engineer by thinking conventionally. She pulled out her notebook and began sketching, her mind racing through possibilities. A tension system anchored to bedrock 50 feet below, flexible joints that could move with the cliff's natural settling, materials that could bend without breaking. The sound of machinery grew louder. Sarah worked her way to the edge of the ledge and peered down. 30 feet below, partially hidden by an overhang, she could see the arm of an excavator working against the cliff face. As she watched, A chunk of rock the size of a refrigerator broke free and tumbled into the ocean. "Hey!" she shouted. "You're undermining this whole section." The excavator's engine cut off abruptly. Sarah waited, but no one emerged from the machine. After several minutes of silence, the engine roared back to life, and the digging resumed with renewed intensity. Sarah scrambled back up the path, her mind reeling. Someone was actively destabilizing the cliff beneath her building site. The vandalism, the undermining work, the figure watching from above, none of this was coincidental. She reached her car and fumbled for the satellite phone she'd packed for emergencies. Her fingers shook as she dialed Marcus Webb's number. "Sarah, I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon. Marcus, someone's sabotaging the site. There's an excavator undermining the cliff face and—" "Slow down. What excavator? The site is supposed to be completely isolated." "That's what I thought too, but someone's down there right now, and they're making the whole section unstable. If they keep this up for another day, the ledge could collapse entirely." A long pause. "Sarah, are you sure you're reading the situation correctly? You've been under enormous stress lately." The dismissive tone in his voice made her jaw clench. "I'm not imagining this, Marcus. Someone doesn't want this project to succeed. Who would care about one house on a remote cliff?" It was a fair question, and Sarah didn't have a good answer. The Hartwell case had made her enemies, but would anyone really go to these lengths to stop her from building again? "I don't know," she admitted, "but I'm not backing down. I'll document everything and keep you posted. Just be careful, Sarah. And remember, you don't have to prove anything to anyone." But as Sarah hung up and looked back toward the cliff, she knew that wasn't true. She had everything to prove and nowhere else to go. Someone wanted her to fail, which meant she absolutely had to succeed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cliff face as Sarah stood at the edge of what would become her redemption or her final failure. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly below, its waves crashing against jagged rocks with a violence that seemed to mock her ambitions. She'd been awake since 4, reviewing calculations that made her head spin and her confidence waver. Behind her, the sound of approaching vehicles broke the coastal silence. Marcus Rivera climbed out of his pickup truck, followed by 3 members of his crew. Even from a distance, Sarah could read the skepticism in their weathered faces. They'd built houses on challenging terrain before, but nothing like this. "Morning, Sarah," Marcus called out, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that didn't quite mask his concern. "Ready to attempt the impossible?" She managed a smile that felt more genuine than expected. "Define impossible." As the crew unloaded equipment, Sarah noticed a black SUV parked on the access road above. The same vehicle she'd spotted yesterday during her site survey and again last night outside the motel. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but she felt eyes watching her every movement. "Marcus," she said quietly, nodding toward the SUV. "Friend of yours?" He followed her gaze and frowned. "Never seen it before. Could be county inspectors. They've been sniffing around a lot of projects lately." But something in his tone suggested he didn't believe his own explanation any more than she did. The first phase required drilling core samples to determine the exact composition of the cliff face. Sarah had studied geological surveys, but she needed current data to finalize her foundation design. As the drilling equipment roared to life, she climbed down the treacherous slope using ropes and anchors, her hard hat feeling inadequate against the very real possibility of rockfall. 20 feet down, she discovered her first problem. The rock face showed signs of recent fracturing that weren't visible from above. Stress patterns spider-webbed through what should have been solid granite, suggesting the cliff was less stable than even her worst-case projections. "This is bad," she muttered, photographing the fissures with her phone. Each crack represented a potential failure point, a place where her carefully calculated loads could find weakness and exploit it. A sharp whistle from above made her look up. Marcus was pointing inland, where a silver sedan had joined the black SUV. 2 men in business suits stood beside it, both wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky. One was speaking into a phone while watching her through binoculars. Sarah's stomach clenched. This wasn't casual observation. Someone was documenting her every move, waiting for her to fail, or perhaps planning to ensure she did. She rappelled back up to find Marcus's crew looking nervous. Word had spread quickly through the construction community about her fall from grace, and being associated with a disgraced architect carried its own risks. Men who relied on steady work couldn't afford to be seen supporting someone the industry had branded a troublemaker. "The rock samples show we can work with this," she announced, projecting confidence she didn't feel. "But we'll need to modify the foundation design." What she didn't say was that the modifications would require techniques so experimental that no building inspector in their right mind would approve them. She'd have to build first and seek forgiveness later, assuming the structure didn't collapse and kill someone in the process. As they discussed logistics, Sarah noticed the silver sedan's occupants were now walking down toward the construction site. The taller man had the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed, while his companion kept one hand inside his jacket in a way that made her skin crawl. "Miss Chen?" The tall man's voice carried the authority of money and connections. "I'm Robert Kelman, representing certain interested parties. We'd like a word." Sarah recognized the name immediately. Kelman was a corporate fixer, the kind of man companies hired when problems needed to disappear quietly. His presence here meant her troubles went far deeper than professional sabotage. "I'm busy," she replied, not moving from where she stood near the cliff edge. "This concerns your former employer and certain revelations that have caused significant financial disruption. My clients are prepared to be generous in exchange for your cooperation." The offer hung in the air like fog rolling in from the ocean. Sarah understood the subtext perfectly. Walk away from this project, keep quiet about what she'd discovered at Davidson and Associates, and her problems would vanish along with her integrity. Marcus stepped closer, his crew forming a loose circle around her. Whatever his own doubts about the project, he wouldn't let her face this alone. "Like I said," Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the wind, "I'm busy building something." Kelman's smile was as cold as the ocean spray. "I hope you reconsider, Ms. Chen. Accidents happen so easily on construction sites, especially ones as dangerous as this." The threat was delivered with the casual tone of someone commenting on the weather, which somehow made it infinitely more terrifying. The storm had passed, but Sarah's hands still trembled as she surveyed the damage at first light. 3 weeks of work lay scattered across the cliff face like broken dreams. Her carefully positioned foundation anchors had held, barely, but the temporary platform that housed her equipment now dangled at a sickening angle, held by a single steel cable that groaned with each gust of wind. She rappelled down to assess the carnage, her breath forming clouds in the frigid morning air. The concrete mixer had tumbled into the ravine below, along with most of her hand tools and the generator that powered her equipment. Insurance wouldn't cover this, not after the investigative report had labeled her a liability. The remaining funds from selling her apartment were already stretched thin, and this setback might force her to abandon the project entirely. That's exactly what someone wanted. As Sarah climbed back to solid ground, she found Marcus Webb waiting beside her truck, his expensive suit incongruous against the rugged landscape. Webb had been Meridian Construction's lead attorney during the Riverside Plaza hearings, the man who'd systematically dismantled her credibility with surgical precision. "Terrible shame about the storm," he said, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. "Mother Nature can be so unpredictable in these parts. What do you want, Webb?" He pulled out a tablet, swiping to a news article. The headline made Sarah's stomach drop. "Disgraced architect endangers community with reckless cliff construction." The piece cited anonymous engineering experts who claimed her project violated multiple safety codes and posed a threat to the coastal highway below. "Public opinion is turning against you," Webb said smoothly. "The county planning office is getting calls, lots of them. People are concerned about liability, about what happens when your little experiment comes crashing down." Sarah scanned the article, noting the carefully planted quotes, and technical jargon designed to sound authoritative to lay people. This is all fabricated. Is it? You're attempting something that's never been done before, using untested methods. Some might call that innovation. Others might call it reckless endangerment. He pocketed the tablet. There's still time to walk away gracefully. Meridian Industries has authorized me to make you an offer. The number he quoted would solve her immediate financial problems and leave enough for a modest restart elsewhere. All she had to do was publicly acknowledge that the Cliff House project was too dangerous to continue and cease all construction activities. Blood money, Sarah said. Practical money. You've made your point, Miss Chen. You've shown remarkable determination, but this ends badly for everyone if you persist. His tone carried an edge now, the velvet glove slipping. The storm damage is just the beginning. Projects like this face all sorts of unexpected complications. After Webb left, Sarah sat in her truck for a long time, staring at the cliff face. The smart play was to take the money and disappear. She could start over in another state, maybe teach architecture at a small college where her history wouldn't follow her. Live quietly, safely. But James Moreau's wife would still be a widow. The families affected by Riverside Plaza would never see justice. And somewhere else, Meridian's cost-cutting measures would claim more lives. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Check your email. You're not alone. A friend. The attached files made her pulse quicken. Geological surveys, engineering reports, and correspondence between Meridian executives, all stamped with dates from 6 months ago. Someone had been monitoring her project from the beginning, documenting every step. But more importantly, the files contained evidence that Meridian had known about similar soil instability issues at 3 other construction sites and had chosen to proceed anyway. The final document was a memo from Richard Hartwell, Meridian's CEO, authorizing necessary measures to neutralize the Chen situation before it impacts our pending contracts. The language was corporate speak, but the implication was clear. Sarah's hands stopped shaking. The storm hadn't been misfortune, it had been engineered. Someone with access to weather data and construction schedules had sabotaged her equipment, timing the damage to coincide with the natural weather event to mask their intervention. She opened her laptop and began drafting emails to every contact she still had in the industry. If Meridian wanted a war, she'd give them one. But first, she needed allies. The anonymous files contained names. Other engineers and architects who'd been blacklisted for refusing to compromise on safety standards. People who understood what it meant to lose everything for doing the right thing. By sunset, she had replies from 7 former colleagues. By midnight, 3 had committed to help, offering equipment, expertise, and most importantly, credible witness accounts of Meridian's pattern of intimidation. Sarah walked to the cliff edge and looked down at the broken platform swaying in the wind. Tomorrow she'd start rebuilding, but this time she wouldn't be working alone. The impossible house would rise from this rock face, not just as shelter, but as a monument to everyone Meridian had tried to silence. The real construction was just beginning. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the construction plans scattered across her kitchen table. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she couldn't bring herself to move away from the documents that represented her last chance at redemption. The Whitmore project was more than just building a house on an unstable cliff. It was her opportunity to prove that Marcus Aldrich hadn't destroyed her completely. The preliminary soil reports painted a grim picture. The cliff face consisted of layered sedimentary rock with unstable shale formations that had been compromised by decades of coastal erosion. Any conventional foundation would fail within months, if not weeks. She needed something revolutionary, something that would work with the natural forces instead of fighting against them. Her phone buzzed against the wooden surface. Marcus Aldrich's name appeared on the screen, and her stomach clenched. She'd been avoiding his calls for 3 days. "Sarah, we need to talk." His voice carried that familiar edge of controlled authority. "I know about the Whitmore Commission. I'm not backing down, Marcus. You're making a mistake. That cliff is a death trap, and when it fails, and it will fail, the blood will be on your hands. Again." The line went dead. leaving Sarah staring at her reflection in the phone's black screen. The word again echoed in her mind, dragging her back to the Meridian Tower collapse. 17 people had died because she'd trusted the wrong calculations, because she'd been too naive to question Marcus's cost-cutting measures. A sharp knock at her door jolted her from the memory. Through the peephole, she saw Elena Whitmore standing on her doorstep, her silver hair catching the afternoon light. "Mrs. Whitmore, I wasn't expecting—" "Call me Elena, and I apologize for the intrusion, but I wanted to discuss something important." Elena's eyes swept over the cluttered apartment, taking in the architectural drawings that covered every available surface. "I see you're taking this project seriously." Sarah cleared a space on the couch, pushing aside a stack of engineering textbooks. "I won't lie to you. This is the most challenging project I've ever attempted. The geological conditions are worse than I initially thought." Elena settled into the cleared space, her gaze steady and unreadable. "My husband built his fortune on impossible projects. Oil rigs in hurricane zones, bridges across impossible canyons. He used to say that the word impossible was just another way of saying expensive. This isn't about money. The physics are working against us." "Are they?" Elena reached into her purse and withdrew a leather portfolio. "Before my husband died, he acquired some unusual materials through his petroleum contacts. Experimental composites that were being developed for deep-sea drilling platforms." Sarah opened the portfolio and found herself looking at specifications for a carbon fiber composite reinforced with graphene lattices. The material possessed incredible tensile strength while remaining flexible enough to absorb seismic stress. It was exactly what she needed for a foundation that could adapt to the cliff's movement rather than resist it. This must have cost a fortune. "Money isn't the issue. My husband left me more than I could spend in several lifetimes." Elena's voice softened. "What I need is someone brave enough to build his dream. Someone who understands that great architecture requires great risk." Sarah studied the material specifications, her mind already racing through design possibilities. A pier foundation system using these composites could work like a spider web, distributing load across multiple contact points while maintaining flexibility. It was brilliant, dangerous, and completely untested at this scale. "There's something else," Elena said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I've been receiving calls. Someone who claims to represent my best interests has been suggesting that I reconsider this project. They seem to know quite a bit about your previous work." The portfolio slipped from Sarah's hands, papers scattering across the floor. "Marcus, you know this person?" Sarah knelt to gather the scattered documents, her mind working furiously. Marcus's reach extended far beyond their old firm. He had connections throughout the city's construction industry, favors to call in, pressure points to exploit. If he was targeting Elena, it meant he saw the Whitmore project as a genuine threat. "He was my partner, before everything fell apart." Sarah met Elena's eyes. "He's dangerous, and he won't stop with phone calls. Then we'd better move quickly." Elena stood, smoothing her skirt with practiced composure. "I'll have the materials delivered to the site tomorrow. How soon can you have your foundation plans ready?" Sarah looked at the scattered papers, at the impossible specifications, at the chance to rebuild everything she'd lost. The smart move would be to walk away, to find something safer, something that wouldn't put her in Marcus's crosshairs again. Instead, she gathered the papers and nodded. "Give me 48 hours. As Elena's footsteps faded down the hallway, Sarah returned to her kitchen table with renewed purpose. She had 48 hours to design the impossible, and Marcus Aldrich breathing down her neck. The real work was just beginning. The foundation work began at dawn, but by noon, Sarah knew something was catastrophically wrong. The concrete mixer truck that had arrived wasn't delivering the specialized high-strength mix she'd ordered. Instead, the driver was pumping standard residential concrete into her carefully prepared forms, concrete that would crumble under the cliff face's unique stresses within months. "Stop!" Sarah sprinted across the worksite, waving her arms frantically. "Cut the pump, now!" The driver, A heavy-set man with oil-stained coveralls gave her a dismissive look. "Lady, I got my delivery order right here. This is what you ordered." Sarah snatched the clipboard from his hands, her heart hammering as she scanned the paperwork. Every specification had been changed. Where she'd written 4,000 psi with polymer additives, someone had substituted standard 2,500 psi mix. The signature at the bottom looked like hers, but the handwriting was slightly off, close enough to fool a casual observer. "This isn't my signature," she said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Someone tampered with this order." The driver shrugged. "Take it up with the office. I just deliver what's on the paper." Marcus appeared at her elbow, his expression grim, as he studied the forms already half-filled with the inferior concrete. "We'll have to jackhammer it all out," he said quietly. "Start over. But Sarah," he lowered his voice further, "that's going to put us 3 days behind schedule and cost us nearly $8,000 we don't have." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. 3 days would push them dangerously close to the weather window Dr. Patel had warned about. The marine layer that protected the cliff face from the worst Pacific storms was already showing signs of instability. Miss that window, and they'd be building through winter weather that could wash the entire project into the sea. "Who had access to these orders?" she asked Marcus, watching the concrete truck driver begin the laborious process of reversing the pour. "They go through the general contractor's office," Marcus replied. "But honestly, Sarah, half a dozen people could have gotten to them. The office manager, the scheduling coordinator, even the delivery dispatcher." A chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze crept up Sarah's spine. The sabotage was escalating, becoming more sophisticated. Whoever was behind this understood construction well enough to know exactly which changes would cause maximum damage while appearing like simple mistakes. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Nice try with the concrete. Next time won't be so easy to fix." Sarah's hands trembled as she showed the message to Marcus. His weathered face darkened, and for a moment she saw the steel that had carried him through 30 years of dangerous construction work. "We need to call the police," he said flatly. "And tell them what? That someone changed a concrete order? They'll say it's a business dispute." Sarah deleted the message, though she knew it was probably pointless. "Besides, we can't afford any more delays." The afternoon was a costly blur of jackhammers and frustrated workers. Sarah found herself checking over her shoulder constantly, jumping at every unexpected sound. The cliff face that had seemed like a challenging canvas that morning now felt exposed and vulnerable, like they were building a target instead of a home. As the crew prepared the forms for a second pour, Sarah noticed Tom Brennan's pickup truck parked on the access road above. He sat in the driver's seat, talking animatedly on his phone while watching their operation through binoculars. When he spotted her looking, he offered a mocking salute before driving away. "That bastard," Marcus muttered. "Want me to have a word with him?" Sarah shook her head, though every instinct screamed for action. "Not yet. But document everything. Photos, times, witnesses. If this goes to court, I want evidence." The replacement concrete arrived just before sunset, the correct mixture this time, verified by Sarah's own testing kit. As they worked under floodlights to complete the critical foundation pour, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched from the darkness beyond the light's reach. Dr. Patel appeared as they finished, her usually composed demeanor showing cracks of concern. "I heard about the concrete problem," she said, pulling Sarah aside. "Sarah, I've been thinking about this project, and I'm wondering if I should quit?" Sarah's voice carried an edge sharper than she intended. "If I should let them win?" Dr. Patel studied her for a long moment. "I'm wondering if you should consider that whoever's doing this might escalate to physical danger. Sabotaging materials is one thing, but if they're desperate enough..." Sarah looked out at the concrete cure slowly in the portable heaters they'd brought to speed the process. Tomorrow they'd begin the vertical work, the most dangerous phase of construction. And somewhere in the darkness, someone was planning their next move to ensure she'd never see this house completed. The morning mist clung to the cliff face like ghostly fingers as Sarah surveyed the concrete that should have been setting overnight. Instead of the solid grey foundation she'd expected, she found a soupy mess that hadn't cured properly. Her heart sank as she knelt beside the forms, watching her gloved fingers sink easily into what should have been rock-hard concrete. "This is impossible," she muttered, pulling out her phone to check the weather data. No unexpected rain, no temperature drops that would explain the failure. She'd supervised every aspect of the pour herself, double-checking the mix ratios and additives designed for the challenging coastal environment. Marcus appeared at the top of the cliff, rappelling gear already strapped on. "How bad is it?" "We'll have to jackhammer it all out and start over. That's another week minimum." Sarah's voice was tight with frustration. "But Marcus, this doesn't make sense. I've used this exact mix in worse conditions." As Marcus descended to examine the concrete himself, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Scattered around the worksite were torn bags of what looked like sugar. She picked up one of the remnants, her architectural training immediately connecting the dots. Sugar was notorious among contractors for its ability to prevent concrete from setting properly. A dirty trick used in industrial sabotage. "Someone's been here," she called down to Marcus, holding up the evidence. His face darkened as he looked up at her. "The security cameras?" Sarah was already moving toward the small, weatherproof box housing their surveillance equipment. The lock hung open, and inside the hard drive was missing. Professional work. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were looking for. The sound of an approaching vehicle made them both freeze. A black sedan wound its way down the coastal access road, far too expensive and clean for the rural location. Sarah felt her chest tighten as she recognized the figure emerging from the driver's seat. David Hartwell stepped carefully across the rocky ground, his Italian leather shoes absurdly out of place on the construction site. The former Meridian Industries executive looked older than when she'd last seen him in court, his silver hair now completely white, but his cold smile remained unchanged. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying the same patronizing tone she remembered, "I heard you were playing architect again. Though from the looks of things, it's not going particularly well. What are you doing here, David?" She positioned herself between him and Marcus, who was still anchored to the cliff face. "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd see how my old colleague was faring." His gaze swept over the ruined concrete, the torn sugar bags, and Sarah's obvious distress. These remote sites can be so vulnerable to setbacks. The implication was clear, but Sarah forced herself to remain calm. "If you're here to gloat, you've made your point. Now leave." David's smile widened. "Actually, I'm here with an offer. A way out of this impossible situation you've put yourself in." He pulled a folded document from his jacket. "Meridian Industries is prepared to purchase this land at well above market value, enough to pay off your debts and give you a fresh start somewhere else. The land isn't for sale." "Everything's for sale, Sarah. It's just a matter of price." His tone hardened. "The question is whether you'll accept our generous offer or whether you'll continue to struggle against forces beyond your control." Marcus had climbed back up during the conversation, and Sarah could feel his presence behind her, solid and reassuring. "She said no," he interjected, stepping up beside her. David's attention shifted to Marcus for the first time, his expression calculating. "And you are someone who doesn't like corporate bullies. How refreshing. Though I wonder if your idealism will survive what's coming." David turned back to Sarah. "You see, we've discovered some interesting irregularities in your building permits. It seems there may have been errors in the environmental impact assessments. The county is conducting a full review." Sarah's stomach dropped. A permit review could shut down construction for months, maybe permanently. "You can't—" "I can't what?" "Report concerns about public safety? After your history, I'd think you'd appreciate the importance of proper oversight." David refolded the offer and placed it on a nearby equipment crate. "You have 48 hours to consider our proposal. After that, things become significantly more complicated." As he walked back to his car, Sarah felt the weight of the mountain pressing down on her shoulders. The sabotage concrete was just the beginning. David Hartwell and Meridian Industries weren't going to stop until they destroyed everything she'd worked to rebuild. "We fight this," Marcus said quietly, reading her thoughts. Sarah picked up the contract without looking at it and tore it in half, letting the pieces scatter in the coastal wind. "We fight this," she agreed, though she wondered if they were already too late. The black sedan disappeared around the coastal bend, but its message lingered like smoke in the morning air. The real battle was just beginning. The morning mist clung to the cliff face like a shroud as Sarah descended the makeshift rope ladder to the construction platform. Each rung felt precarious beneath her boots, but she'd grown accustomed to the constant dance with gravity. What she hadn't grown accustomed to was the persistent feeling of being watched. Marcus was already on site, checking the foundation anchors that had been installed the previous week. His weathered face looked troubled as he examined the steel cables that would hold the entire structure against the cliff's vertical face. "Something's wrong," he called out, his voice barely audible over the crash of waves below. "These bolts weren't torqued to spec yesterday. Someone's been here overnight." Sarah's stomach dropped. She rappelled down to his position, her hands trembling slightly as she examined the anchor points. 3 of the critical bolts had been loosened just enough to compromise their holding power, but not enough to be immediately obvious. It was sabotage disguised as negligence. "How bad is it?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from Marcus's expression. "If we'd started hanging the main support beams today as planned, the whole platform could have given way." He wiped grease from his hands, leaving dark streaks on his work gloves. "Sarah, this isn't an accident. Someone knew exactly which bolts to target." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Only 3 people had access to the detailed engineering plans showing the anchor specifications: herself, Marcus, and David Kim, the structural engineer who'd been consulting on the project. She trusted Marcus implicitly, and David had been nothing but supportive since agreeing to work with her despite the professional risks. "We need to install security cameras," Sarah said, her mind already racing through the logistics. "And motion sensors. If someone's willing to sabotage the foundation, they won't stop here." As they worked to retorque the bolts to proper specifications, Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was blocked, but something compelled her to answer. "Having fun playing with your little toys on the cliff?" The voice was electronically distorted, mechanical and threatening. "You should have stayed away, Sarah. Some secrets are worth killing for." The line went dead before she could respond. Her hands shook as she lowered the phone, and Marcus noticed immediately. "What is it?" "Someone just threatened me. They know about the construction, know my name." She looked up at the cliff face towering above them, suddenly aware of how exposed they were. "Marcus, what if this isn't just about stopping the construction? What if they want me dead?" The older man's face hardened. "Then we make sure that doesn't happen. But first, we secure this site." They spent the next 2 hours implementing emergency security measures. Marcus had connections from his military days, and within an hour, a discreet security team was installing night vision cameras and motion detectors around the cliff edge and access points. The equipment was expensive, eating into Sarah's dwindling budget, but staying alive took precedence over staying solvent. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the cliff face, David Kim arrived for his scheduled inspection. The young engineer looked haggard, his usually pristine appearance disheveled. He'd been working around the clock on the structural calculations, trying to solve the seemingly impossible challenge of building on a deteriorating cliff face. "I've been running stress models all night," he said, pulling out his tablet to show them the latest simulations. "The foundation design is sound, but we're fighting geology itself. The sandstone is more fractured than the initial surveys indicated." Sarah studied the data, noting the red zones where the cliff face was most unstable. "Can we work around it?" "Maybe, but it means redesigning the entire support system. Instead of traditional anchor points, we'd need to use a distributed load system, like a spider web spread across the rock face. It's never been attempted at this scale." The innovative approach excited Sarah despite their circumstances. This was the kind of challenge that had drawn her to architecture in the first place, the chance to push boundaries and create something impossible. But as she looked at the complex web of forces they'd need to balance, doubt crept in. How long would the redesign take? 2 weeks, minimum. And that's working around the clock. 2 weeks meant 2 more weeks of vulnerability, 2 more weeks of mounting expenses, 2 more weeks for whoever was sabotaging them to escalate their tactics. But it also meant a structure that could truly last, something that could prove her worth as an architect and vindicate her decision to blow the whistle on Hartwell Industries. As the sun began to set, painting the cliff face in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah made her decision. They would implement David's distributed load system, no matter the cost or risk. She'd come too far to compromise now, and whoever was trying to stop her would discover that Sarah Chen didn't back down from a fight. The cliff had claimed many victims over the years, but it wouldn't claim her dream. The blueprints scattered across the makeshift table as another gust of wind swept through the construction site. Sarah pressed her palms against the papers, her knuckles white from gripping them so tightly. 3 weeks into the project, and every day brought new challenges that seemed designed to break her spirit. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of dirt across his weathered face. "That's the 3rd batch of concrete that's come up wrong this week," he said, gesturing toward the rejected mixer truck rumbling away down the narrow access road. "Either our supplier's having quality control issues or someone's making sure we get substandard materials," Sarah finished, her voice barely audible over the crash of waves against the rocks below. She'd been thinking the same thing but hadn't wanted to voice her suspicions. Paranoia was a luxury she couldn't afford, yet the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Elena approached from the cliff edge, where she'd been supervising the installation of the secondary support anchors. Her safety harness gleamed with moisture from the sea spray. "We've got another problem," she called out. "2 of the anchor points are showing stress fractures already. That's not normal wear. The metal looks like it was scored before installation." Sarah's stomach dropped. She walked to the edge and peered down at the steel anchors that would hold the foundation's weight against the cliff face. Even from 20 feet up, she could see the hairline cracks spiderwebbing across the surface. Those anchors had been specifically engineered for this project, tested to withstand forces far beyond what they'd encounter. They shouldn't be failing. "Get me samples of that metal," she said, her architect's mind already calculating the implications. "I want them tested by an independent lab." Marcus joined them at the precipice, following Sarah's gaze to the compromised anchors. If those fail during the next phase of construction, he didn't need to finish the sentence. They all understood. The house's cantilevered sections would collapse into the sea, taking anyone working on them down with it. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. Her phone buzzed against her hip. The caller ID made her heart skip. David Reeves, the investigative journalist who'd first broken the Meridian Tower story. She stepped away from the others before answering. "Sarah, I've been digging into Hartwell Construction's supplier network." David's voice crackled through the connection. "You need to know. 3 companies in your supply chain have financial ties to Victor Hartwell's shell corporations." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "Which companies?" "Metropolitan Concrete, Anchor Point Steel, and Precision Electronics. If someone wanted to sabotage your project from the inside, they'd have access to your materials, structural components, and monitoring systems." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The failed concrete batches, the compromised anchors, and yesterday's mysterious malfunction of their soil stability sensors, all connected to Hartwell's network. Sarah felt exposed on the open cliff, as if unseen eyes were watching her every move. "There's more," David continued. "I've traced some unusual financial activity. Large cash payments to a private security firm that specializes in corporate problem-solving, the kind of problems that require making things go away permanently." Sarah's mouth went dry. "How long do I have?" Based on the payment schedule, I'd say they're planning something within the next few days. Sarah, you need to consider shutting this down and getting somewhere safe. She looked out at the skeletal framework of her impossible house, at Marcus and Elena working despite the mounting dangers, at the dream that was slowly taking shape against all odds. Walking away now would mean admitting defeat, letting Hartwell win, and proving that truth-tellers could be silenced through intimidation and violence. I can't do that, she said finally. This house is my vindication. If I can prove that proper engineering and honest construction practices can build something everyone said was impossible, it validates everything I've fought for. Dead architects don't vindicate anything, David replied bluntly. After ending the call, Sarah stood motionless for several minutes, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. The ocean was relentless, patient, gradually wearing away even the strongest stone. But the cliffs had stood for millennia, adapting and enduring through countless storms. She turned back toward her team, decision crystallizing in her mind. They would continue building, but with new precautions. Every material would be independently tested. Security cameras would monitor the site around the clock. She'd hire her own protection if necessary. Elena noticed her expression immediately. What's happened now? We're being sabotaged systematically, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. But we're going to build this house anyway. We're just going to be smarter about it. Marcus nodded grimly. What do you need us to do? Sarah looked at the compromised anchors, then at the framework rising defiantly from the cliff face. We're going to assume everything is compromised and build redundancies for our redundancies. If they want to stop us, they'll have to do it in the open. The foundation forms had been poured for 3 days when Sarah discovered the first sign of sabotage. She'd arrived at dawn, coffee in hand, ready to check the concrete cure, when she noticed the subtle discoloration along the eastern anchor point. Her stomach dropped as she knelt beside the form and ran her fingers along what should have been smooth, solid concrete. Instead, she found a consistency closer to wet sand. Marcus! Her voice echoed across the cliff face, sharp with panic. He appeared from behind the equipment shed, tool belt jangling as he jogged over. What is it? He took one look at her face, and his expression darkened. Sarah pointed to the compromised section. Someone added accelerator to this pour. Too much of it. The concrete's going to crumble within a week. Marcus crouched beside her, pressing his thumb into the surface. It left a clear indentation. Jesus, when did you last check the materials? Yesterday evening. Everything was perfect. Sarah's mind raced through the timeline. Someone came here after we left. They had to know exactly what they were doing. This isn't random vandalism. They worked in grim silence for the next hour, breaking out the ruined concrete with jackhammers. Each chunk that fell away represented lost time, lost money, and worst of all, lost credibility. Sarah knew word would spread through the construction community like wildfire. The Chen project was having foundation issues. There, Marcus said, wiping sweat from his forehead as they finished clearing the compromised section. We can report this afternoon if the supply truck can make it up here. Sarah's phone buzzed. Detective Morrison's number flashed on the screen. Miss Chen, we found something you need to see. Can you meet me at the station? 20 minutes later, Sarah sat across from Morrison in a sterile interview room, staring at a manila folder thick with photographs and documents. We've been tracking financial records linked to Meridian Construction, Morrison said, sliding a bank statement across the table. Someone's been making regular payments to a private investigator named Dale Hutchinson. $5,000 a month for the past 6 months. Sarah scanned the document, her pulse quickening. What kind of investigation? According to his notes, surveillance and reputation management targeting one Sarah Chen. Morrison's voice was matter-of-fact, but Sarah caught the edge of anger beneath it. Your mail, your phone calls, your project site, this guy's been documenting your every move. And now someone's actively sabotaging my work. Sarah leaned back in her chair, the pieces clicking into place. They're not just watching anymore. They're escalating. Gets worse. Morrison opened the folder wider, revealing surveillance photos of Sarah's cliff site. These were taken yesterday. Notice the timestamp, 11:47 p.m. Someone was there, Sarah, right around when your concrete would have been vulnerable. Sarah studied the grainy images. A figure in dark clothing moved between the equipment, too distant to identify, but clearly purposeful in their movements. Can you enhance these? We're trying, but the distance and lighting make it difficult. What we can tell you is this person knew exactly where to go and what to do. This wasn't their first time on a construction site. Sarah's mind spun through possibilities. A disgruntled former Meridian employee? Someone hired by the company to ensure her failure? The list of people who wanted her project to collapse seemed to grow longer each day. There's something else, Morrison continued. We ran background checks on everyone who's had access to your site. Your crew, suppliers, even the guy who delivers coffee to your trailer. And Jake Morrison, the concrete truck driver who's been making your deliveries. He used to work for Meridian, got laid off 8 months ago, right after their quarterly earnings took a hit from the settlement related to your whistleblowing case. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Jake had seemed so helpful, so knowledgeable about the technical requirements of her unusual build. He'd even suggested cost-saving measures for the specialty concrete mix. Where is he now? That's what we're trying to figure out. He hasn't shown up for work in 2 days, and his apartment's been cleared out. Sarah's phone rang. Marcus, Sarah, you need to get back here now. We've got a problem with the equipment shed. What kind of problem? The kind where someone took bolt cutters to our safety cables and loosened the wheel bolts on the concrete mixer. If I hadn't decided to run a full equipment check this morning... His voice trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Sarah stood abruptly. I'm on my way. As she drove back toward the cliff, her hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, Sarah realized the stakes had fundamentally changed. This wasn't just about professional sabotage anymore. Someone was willing to risk serious injury, or worse, to stop her from completing this build. The question was, how far were they willing to go? The morning fog clung to the cliff face like a shroud as Sarah inspected the foundation anchors one final time. 3 weeks of relentless work had brought the project to its most critical phase, the moment when they would test whether her revolutionary design could actually hold against the unstable geology everyone said would doom it. Marcus emerged from the equipment shed, his face grim. The stress tests are ready, but Sarah, I've been thinking about what happened to Jake's brake lines. Maybe we should wait for... No, Sarah's voice cut through the damp air. Every day we delay gives them another chance to sabotage us. We run the tests today. She watched the crew move with practiced efficiency around the construction site. The past weeks had transformed this impossible location into something that defied every engineering textbook. Her flexible foundation system, inspired by earthquake architecture and marine construction, used a network of interconnected pylons that could shift with the cliff's movement rather than fighting it. Elena Rodriguez approached with a tablet displaying real-time geological readings. The sensors show the cliff is stable this morning, but there's a weather system moving in from the Pacific. We'll have maybe 6 hours before conditions deteriorate. Sarah nodded, studying the data. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was betting everything on a foundation system that embraced instability instead of resisting it, much like her life had become. Sarah, David Kim jogged up from the access road, slightly out of breath. I've got news from the city. The Planning Commission is meeting today about your permits. There's talk they might revoke them based on new safety concerns. What new safety concerns? But even as she asked, Sarah knew. The same forces that had destroyed her career were still pulling strings, still trying to bury her along with the truth about the Meridian Tower collapse. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, his jaw set. Then we better make sure this works on the first try, because something tells me we won't get a second chance. Sarah felt the weight of everyone's faith pressing down on her shoulders. These people had risked their reputations to work on a project most considered suicide. Jake was still in the hospital, his legs slowly healing, but he'd sent word that he believed in what they were building. "Begin the stress test sequence," she called out. The hydraulic systems engaged with a deep mechanical hum. Sarah watched the readouts as tremendous forces began pressing against her foundation design, forces equivalent to a moderate earthquake combined with the worst-case scenario for cliff erosion. For the first few minutes, everything held perfectly. The flexible joints absorbed and redistributed the stress exactly as her calculations predicted. The crew exchanged cautious glances, afraid to celebrate too early. Then Elena's tablet began flashing red warnings. "Pressure spike in Sector 7, she called out. "The eastern anchor point is showing stress fractures." Sarah's heart hammered as she studied the data. This wasn't part of her design failure. The readings were too sudden, too localized. She grabbed binoculars and scanned the cliff face until she found what she was looking for. "Shut it down. Everyone back from the edge." A section of cliff face that should have been solid showed fresh tool marks around one of the anchor points. Someone had been there during the night, weakening the rock with surgical precision, enough to cause failure under stress, but not enough to be obvious during routine inspection. As the crew scrambled to safety, Sarah felt rage building in her chest. This wasn't just about stopping her project anymore. Someone was willing to cause a catastrophic failure that could kill her entire team. "David, call the police," she said, still staring at the sabotaged anchor point, "and get me samples of those rock chips. I want to know exactly what tools they used." Elena was already recalculating. "If we can replace that anchor point and reinforce the surrounding rock, the test data from the other sections proves your design works. We're talking about maybe a 2-day delay. 2 days we don't have if they revoke our permits today." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. "Marcus, can we modify the eastern section to use a different anchor configuration, something that bypasses the damaged area?" Marcus studied the cliff face with the eye of someone who'd spent 30 years making the impossible work. "It's risky. We'd be improvising structural modifications on the fly." "Everything about this project is risky." Sarah turned to face her team. "But I'm not backing down. Someone wants us to fail badly enough to commit sabotage, which means we're closer to success than they can tolerate." The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the full scope of what they'd built. A house that seemed to grow from the cliff itself, defying gravity and conventional wisdom. It was beautiful and impossible and absolutely necessary. "We rebuild the anchor point," Sarah decided, "and this time we post guards. If they want to stop us, they'll have to do it in broad daylight." The sound of splintering wood cut through the dawn silence like a gunshot. Sarah's eyes snapped open in her tent, heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment she lay frozen, listening to the waves crash below and wondering if she'd dreamed it. Then she heard Marcus cursing from the direction of the construction site. She scrambled out of her sleeping bag and pulled on her boots, not bothering to change from her thermal underwear and oversized flannel shirt. The morning air bit at her exposed skin as she emerged from the tent. Marcus stood near the edge of the platform, his silhouette dark against the grey pre-dawn sky. "What happened?" she called out, jogging toward him. He turned, his face grim. "Someone's been here. Look." Sarah's stomach dropped as she surveyed the damage. 3 of the newly installed support beams had been sawed partway through, not enough to cause an immediate collapse, but sufficient to create a catastrophic failure once weight was applied. The cuts were clean, deliberate, and positioned exactly where they would cause maximum structural damage while remaining hidden from casual inspection. "When?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Had to be some time between when we left last night and now. These cuts are fresh, no weather damage, no rust." Marcus ran his fingers along one of the severed beams. "Sarah, if we hadn't caught this, if someone had walked out here when we started work today..." She didn't need him to finish. The sabotaged beams would have given way under the slightest load, sending anyone on the platform plummeting to the rocks below. Her hands trembled as she examined the precise angles of the cuts. This wasn't random vandalism. Someone with construction knowledge had done this. "We need to call the police," Marcus said. "And tell them what? That someone cut some beams on an unauthorized construction project that we're building without permits on unstable land?" Sarah shook her head. "They'll shut us down immediately. Better than having you dead." The words hung between them like a challenge. Sarah stared out at the horizon where the sun was beginning to paint the sky in soft pinks and oranges. 3 weeks of back-breaking work, of proving that the impossible could be done, and now this. Someone was escalating beyond threatening phone calls and bureaucratic roadblocks. "Help me document everything," she said finally. "Photos, measurements, everything. Then we replace the damaged beams and keep going." "Sarah, I know what you're going to say, that this is too dangerous, that I should walk away." She met his eyes. "But I can't. Not now. We're so close to proving this design works. If I stop now, everyone will say it was because the project was flawed, not because someone sabotaged it." Marcus studied her face in the growing light. "You know who did this, don't you?" Sarah thought about the precision of the cuts, the knowledge required to target exactly the right structural points. It wasn't random. Someone understood her design well enough to know precisely how to undermine it. The list of people with that level of insight was short. "I have suspicions," she admitted, "but no proof." They spent the next hour photographing the damage from every angle. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters wanting updates on the Cliff House project that had somehow made its way into the local news. She ignored them all, focusing on the grim task of cataloguing the sabotage. As they worked, a familiar truck pulled up to the makeshift access road above them. Sarah's blood ran cold as she recognized the vehicle, one of Whitman Industries' company trucks. A figure emerged and began making his way down the steep path to their platform. "Expecting company?" Marcus asked quietly. "No." Sarah straightened, steeling herself for confrontation. The man who approached wasn't who she'd expected. Instead of David Whitman or one of his usual corporate lieutenants, a younger man in his 30s picked his way carefully across the rocky terrain. He wore expensive hiking boots and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to construction sites. "Miss Chen?" He extended his hand as he reached the platform. "I'm Jake Morrison, senior engineer with Whitman Industries." Sarah didn't take his hand. "If you're here to deliver another cease and desist order, you're wasting your time." Morrison glanced at the damaged beams, and Sarah caught something in his expression, surprise that seemed genuine. "Actually, I'm here because I think you should know what you're really up against." He lowered his voice, looking back toward the cliff, as if checking whether they could be overheard. "The Ocean View collapse wasn't an accident, and the people responsible think you know more than you're saying." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" "Meet me tonight. Pier 47, Warehouse District. Come alone." Morrison turned to leave, then paused. "And Miss Chen? Those beams weren't cut by amateurs. Whoever did this has access to professional equipment and detailed knowledge of your structural plans. Watch your back." He disappeared up the path as quickly as he'd come, leaving Sarah staring after him with a growing sense that everything she thought she knew was about to change. The storm arrived 3 hours ahead of schedule, turning the sky black as tar and sending waves crashing against the cliff face with bone-rattling force. Sarah pressed herself against the reinforced concrete beam she'd been inspecting, salt spray stinging her face as the wind threatened to tear her from the scaffolding. She should have evacuated with Marcus and the crew when the weather alert started screaming across their radios. Should have listened when he'd grabbed her shoulders and shouted over the rising wind that no inspection was worth dying for. But something had been nagging at her all morning, a subtle vibration in the foundation supports that didn't match her calculations. Now, clinging to the structure as it swayed in the hurricane-force gusts, she understood why. The north anchor point was failing. Through sheets of driving rain, she could see the massive bolt that secured the house's primary support beam, slowly working its way out of the cliff face. Each wave that crashed below sent tremors up through the rock, and with every tremor, the bolt shifted another fraction of an inch. Sarah fumbled for her radio with numb fingers. "Marcus, do you copy?" Static answered her. The storm was jamming communications, and she was alone on a structure that could collapse at any moment. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to think through the engineering. The north anchor was critical. It bore 30% of the house's weight. If it failed completely, the entire structure would pivot and tear itself apart. But she'd designed redundancies, backup systems that should kick in automatically, unless someone had sabotaged them too. The thought sent ice through her veins, colder than the rain. Throughout the project, equipment had mysteriously malfunctioned, materials had arrived damaged, and now the one component that could bring everything down was failing in the middle of a storm. Too convenient, too perfectly timed. Another massive wave struck, and the bolt shifted visibly. Sarah didn't have time to wait for rescue or backup. She had minutes, maybe less. Fighting against the wind, she worked her way along the scaffolding toward the emergency toolbox Marcus had insisted they keep mounted on every level. Her hands were so cold she could barely feel them, but muscle memory guided her to the impact wrench and replacement hardware. The scaffolding bucked and swayed as she moved, each gust threatening to throw her into the churning waters below. She'd never been afraid of heights, but this was different. This was a mechanical bull made of steel and fury, trying to shake her loose. She reached the anchor point just as another bolt head became visible, working its way out of the rock. Up close, she could see scratches around the threading that weren't from normal wear. Someone had loosened these bolts deliberately, counting on the storm to finish the job. Sarah positioned the impact wrench, but her hands were shaking too badly to get a good grip. The wind kept shifting direction, slamming her against the concrete one moment and trying to pull her away the next. She needed both hands for the wrench, but that meant letting go of her safety line. Below her, a wave crashed with the sound of an explosion, sending spray high enough to soak her boots. The house groaned and shifted, and she watched in horror as the bolt she was trying to secure turned another quarter-inch. No choice. Sarah unclipped her safety harness and wrapped her legs around the support beam, using her thighs to anchor herself while both hands worked the wrench. The bolt was fighting her, cross-threaded from the sabotage, but she forced it back into alignment and began driving it home. One bolt secure, 3 more to go. Her legs were cramping from the strain of holding on, and the wind was getting worse. In the distance, she could see emergency lights. Marcus must have called for help, but they'd never make it up the cliff in this weather, not in time. The second bolt went in easier, and the third. As she worked on the fourth and final anchor, the house suddenly stopped swaying. The reinforcement was holding, distributing the load properly again. But her relief was short-lived. As she tightened the last bolt, a new sound cut through the storm, the whine of an engine. A speedboat was approaching through the churning waters, its spotlights sweeping the cliff face. Sarah's blood turned to ice as the light found her. She recognized the silhouette in the boat's cabin, Thompson, the city inspector who'd been blocking her permits from the beginning. He wasn't here to rescue her. The boat moved closer to the cliff, close enough that she could see Thompson's face in the harsh light. He was holding something, a rifle. The same man who'd been sabotaging her project was here to finish the job personally. Sarah pressed herself against the concrete as the first shot rang out, the bullet sparking off the steel beam inches from her head. She was trapped on the scaffolding with nowhere to run, no way down, and the man who'd been trying to destroy her life was finally ready to destroy her. The storm raged on, but now Sarah faced a different kind of tempest, one with deadly intent and a scope trained on her heart. The explosion echoed across the valley like thunder, reverberating off the cliff walls and settling into Sarah's bones. She pressed herself against the cold stone, heart hammering as debris rained down around her. The main support beam, 3 months of work, lay twisted and smoking 50 feet below. Marcus emerged from behind the equipment shed, his face a mask of calculated concern. "Jesus, Sarah, are you okay?" He scrambled toward her, boots crunching on scattered concrete chunks. She studied his approach, noting how his eyes swept the destruction with something that looked almost like satisfaction. "I'm fine." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. But the beam isn't. What the hell happened? I heard the blast from the road. Marcus reached for her arm, but she stepped away. Good question. Sarah's gaze moved to the severed cables that had held the beam in place. The cuts were too clean, too precise for an accident. Someone wanted to make sure this project fails. Marcus followed her stare, his jaw tightening. You think this was sabotage? The word hung between them like an accusation. Sarah had been dancing around the possibility for weeks, the missing materials, the equipment failures, the anonymous threats. But seeing the deliberate destruction laid bare before her made denial impossible. I know it was. She pulled out her phone, photographing the evidence before anyone could disturb it. The question is, who has access to the site? Could be anyone. You haven't exactly made this place secure. There was something in his tone that made her look up sharply. Marcus met her gaze without flinching, but she caught a flicker of something. Guilt? Fear? Before she could analyze it further, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. 2 pickup trucks wound their way up the narrow access road, kicking up clouds of dust. Sarah recognized the lead vehicle immediately, Connor Murphy's red Ford. Behind him came Jake and 2 other workers she'd hired just last week. Connor jumped out before his truck fully stopped, his face grim. Heard an explosion. Everyone accounted for? Sarah and I are fine, Marcus called out, but we've got a problem. The crew gathered around the twisted wreckage, their expressions ranging from shock to anger. Jake picked up a piece of the severed cable, examining the clean cut with a welder's practiced eye. This wasn't no accident, he announced. Someone took a torch to these cables, did it neat and professional. Sarah felt the weight of their stares. These men had invested weeks in this impossible project, believing in her vision when no one else would. Now someone was systematically destroying their work. Who else knows about the construction schedule? Connor asked quietly. Just us, Sarah replied, then paused. And whoever's been watching us. She told them about the figure she'd spotted on the opposite ridge 3 days ago, the one with binoculars who'd vanished when she tried to get a closer look. About the phone calls that disconnected when she answered, about the feeling of being observed that had been growing stronger each day. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. You didn't mention any of this before. I wasn't sure. Now I am. Connor walked to the edge of the platform, studying the cliff face where the beam should have been anchored. We can rebuild it, he said finally. But it'll take another month, maybe more. And if someone's actively sabotaging us, they'll just destroy it again. Sarah finished the thought that none of them wanted to voice, unless we catch them first. The implications settled over the group like a cold fog. They were isolated up here, vulnerable, with winter approaching and the foundations still incomplete. Every day of delay brought them closer to the weather window closing entirely. There's something else, Jake said reluctantly. Got a call this morning from my supplier. Someone's been asking questions about our material orders, trying to find out our delivery schedule. Sarah's blood chilled. What kind of questions? Professional ones, like they knew the business. My guy thought it was another contractor, maybe looking to steal the account. Jake's weathered face was troubled. But now it looks like intelligence gathering, Connor finished grimly. Marcus had been unusually quiet during this exchange. Sarah noticed him checking his watch, glancing toward the road as if expecting someone. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away. We need to involve the police, she said. And tell them what? Marcus's voice was sharp. That someone blew up a construction beam. They'll say it's a workplace accident, maybe cite us for safety violations. He wasn't wrong. The local authorities had made their skepticism about the project clear from the beginning. They'd be more likely to shut down the site than investigate the sabotage. Then we handle it ourselves, Connor said quietly. Set up watches, security cameras. Turn this into a fortress if we have to. Sarah nodded, but her mind was already moving beyond defensive measures. Someone wanted her to fail badly enough to resort to violence. That meant she was close to something, close enough to be dangerous. The question was, Dangerous to whom? The foundation poured smooth as silk in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah's headlamp cutting through the mist rising from the ocean below. Every calculation had led to this moment, the revolutionary anchor system that would grip the cliff face like roots through stone. But as the concrete settled into the custom-formed channels, a metallic glint caught her eye. She knelt beside the eastern anchor point, brushing away loose debris. Her blood turned to ice. Someone had tampered with the rebar grid, cutting strategic supports and welding them back with inferior joins. The sabotage was subtle, nearly invisible, but it would ensure catastrophic failure within hours of the concrete curing. "Marcus!" Her voice echoed off the cliff walls as she grabbed her radio. "Get down here now. Bring cutting tools." While waiting, Sarah's mind raced through the implications. The sabotage wasn't random. It targeted the exact stress point she'd identified in her revolutionary design. Someone with engineering knowledge had studied her plans, understood her innovations, and methodically planned to destroy them. Marcus rappelled down the cliff face, his equipment pack clanging against the rock. "What's wrong?" Sarah pointed to the compromised joints. "We have maybe 30 minutes before this set's too hard to fix. Start cutting here while I work on the western anchor." They worked in desperate silence, the ocean wind whipping around them as they raced against the concrete's curing time. Sarah's angle grinder sparked against the sabotaged rebar, each cut bringing them closer to either salvation or complete failure. Sarah Marcus's voice was tight. "You need to see this." She looked up from her work to find him holding a small device, a wireless transmitter embedded in the concrete form. "Someone's been monitoring everything. They know exactly when we pour, when we cure, probably every move we make." The implications hit her like a physical blow, the permits that got delayed, the inspections that came early. Someone's been orchestrating this from the beginning, but who? And why go to all this trouble? Sarah's mind clicked through the pieces. The construction cover-up that had destroyed her career involved more than just shoddy work. It had been about corner cutting that saved millions. Her innovative cliff-dwelling design proved that safety and engineering excellence could coexist, making the old excuses obsolete. "Because if this works," she said, continuing to cut through the compromised rebar, "it proves they didn't have to cut corners. It proves people died for profit, not necessity." A sound from above made them both freeze, footsteps on the wooden platform they'd built for equipment access. In the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah couldn't make out who was moving around their construction site, but every instinct screamed danger. "Keep working," she whispered to Marcus. "We're sitting ducks down here if someone wants to cut our lines." But even as they resumed their frantic repairs, Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of equipment being moved. Then came the mechanical whir of the concrete pump starting up. "They're adding something to the mix," Marcus said, looking up at the platform. "Or contaminating what's left." Sarah made a split-second decision. The foundation anchors were their only shot. If those failed, the entire project collapsed, literally and figuratively, but they couldn't complete the repairs with someone actively sabotaging from above. "I'm going up," she said, clipping her ascender to the safety line. "Sarah, don't—" But she was already climbing, using the natural handhold she'd memorized during months of surveying. The cliff face was treacherous in daylight. In darkness, every grip was a gamble. But her rage at being manipulated, at having her life's work threatened, drove her upward. She pulled herself over the platform edge to find a figure hunched over the concrete pump, pouring something into the hopper. In the equipment lights, she recognized the silhouette immediately. David Fletcher. Her former boss from the construction firm turned slowly, a bag of what looked like salt in his hands. "Sarah, you always were too clever for your own good. Salt in the concrete. It'll cause the rebar to corrode from the inside. The foundation would fail in months, not years. The beauty is it would look like natural failure. Ocean salt, coastal erosion, no one would question it." Fletcher's voice was calm, conversational, just like no one questioned the beam specifications that saved us $3 million on the Riverside project. "Until people died. Until you made people die." No one would have known if you'd kept your mouth shut. Now you're trying to prove we could have done it safely all along. Some secrets are worth protecting, Sarah." The platform creaked ominously under their combined weight. Below, Sarah could hear Marcus still working frantically on the anchor repairs, unaware of the confrontation above. Fletcher pulled something from his jacket, not a weapon but wire cutters. Amazing how accidents happen at construction sites, especially when people don't follow proper safety protocols. He moved toward the safety lines that connected Marcus to the platform above. Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that Fletcher wasn't just willing to destroy her project, he was willing to commit murder to protect the conspiracy that had already claimed lives. The next few seconds would determine whether her revolutionary design would change architecture forever, or whether she and Marcus would join the victims of Fletcher's deadly cover-up. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cliff face as Sarah stood at the edge of her creation, watching the final support beam swing into place. 3 months of back-breaking work, sleepless nights, and constant vigilance had led to this moment. The house rose from the rocky outcrop, like something born from the stone itself, its cantilevers extending boldly over the churning ocean below. Marcus wiped sweat from his brow as he guided the crane operator through precise movements. "Last one, Sarah. After this, we're just looking at finish work." She nodded, but couldn't shake the unease that had plagued her all week. The sabotage attempts had stopped 2 weeks ago, right after Detective Morrison arrested one of Hartwell's associates for the equipment tampering. Too clean, too convenient. Men like Hartwell didn't give up when they were this close to losing everything. Her phone buzzed. Morrison's name appeared on the screen. "We've got a problem." His voice was tense. "The guy we arrested? He's been in county lockup for 6 months on an unrelated charge. Someone fed us false information." Sarah's blood chilled. "What does that mean?" "It means whoever's been sabotaging your site is still out there, and they wanted us to think we caught them." The crane's engine coughed, sputtered, then died completely. The massive steel beam swayed precariously in the ocean breeze, suspended 40 feet above the foundation. Marcus was already scrambling toward the operator's cab. "Emergency brakes not responding," the operator shouted. "Something's wrong with the hydraulics." Sarah ran toward the crane's base, her architect's eye immediately spotting the problem. Hydraulic fluid pooled beneath the machine, too much and too fresh to be normal wear. This wasn't mechanical failure, it was sabotage. "Everyone off the platform," she screamed. "The beam's going to drop." Workers scattered as the crane's arms shuddered under the weight of the unsupported steel. The beam began a slow, inexorable swing toward the house's main support column. If it hit, the impact would compromise the entire structure's integrity. Sarah's mind raced through calculations. The beam weighed 3 tons. At this trajectory and speed, it would strike the column at its weakest point, exactly where an engineer would target for maximum damage. "The winch!" she yelled to Marcus. "We need to manually release the cable." "Are you insane? That beam will fall straight down. Better than taking out the whole house." They sprinted toward the manual release mechanism, but Sarah could see they wouldn't make it in time. The beam was already swinging past the point of no return. In seconds, it would strike the column and bring down everything she'd built. Then she saw him. Daniel Hartwell stood on the ridge above, no longer hiding behind intermediaries or hired saboteurs. He held a device in his hands, a remote detonator. The hydraulic failure hadn't been the primary attack, it was the distraction. "Sarah!" Marcus tackled her to the ground just as Hartwell pressed the button. The explosion ripped through the cliff face directly beneath the house's foundation. But instead of the devastating collapse Hartwell expected, something extraordinary happened. The charges, positioned where a conventional foundation would have been weakest, struck only solid rock. Sarah's revolutionary design had anchored the structure's true load-bearing points deeper and at different angles than any traditional blueprint would indicate. The house shuddered but held. Hartwell's face transformed from triumph to rage. He began scrambling down the rocky slope, abandoning all pretense of deniability. Sarah realized with crystal clarity that he intended to finish this personally. "Call Morrison!" she shouted to Marcus, then began climbing toward Hartwell. They met on a narrow ledge halfway between the ridge and the building site. Hartwell was breathing hard, his expensive suit torn by the rocky descent. In his hand, he clutched a hammer taken from the construction site. "You should have taken the money," he snarled. "You should have kept your mouth shut about Pacific Towers." 12 people died because of your shortcuts," Sarah replied, staying just out of his reach. "How many more would have died if I'd stayed silent?" Business is business. People understand acceptable losses. Tell that to the families. Hartwell lunged forward, swinging the hammer in a vicious arc. Sarah dodged backward, her heel catching on loose stone. For a terrifying moment, she teetered on the edge of a 60-foot drop to the rocks below. Hartwell raised the hammer again, but his foot slipped on the same treacherous stones. His arms windmilled desperately as gravity claimed him. Sarah instinctively grabbed his wrist, her other hand clutching a protruding root. For several heartbeats, they hung suspended over the abyss, Sarah's grip the only thing preventing Hartwell's fall. "Why?" he gasped. Below them, sirens wailed as police cars wound up the coastal road. Above them, her impossible house stood proud against the sky, proof that some things were worth fighting for. "Because it's the right thing to do," Sarah said, and began pulling him to safety. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cliff face as Sarah stood at the edge of her impossible dream, now made real. The house perched on what had once been considered unbuildable terrain, its foundation anchored deep into the rock through her revolutionary engineering solution. Every beam, every joint, every carefully calculated stress point represented months of sleepless nights and unwavering determination. Marcus emerged from the house behind her, his footsteps careful on the deck that cantilevered over the precipice. "The final inspection report came through," he said, holding up his phone. "Unanimous approval. They're calling it a masterpiece of sustainable cliff face construction." Sarah nodded, but her attention remained fixed on the horizon. 3 months had passed since the night she'd confronted David Harrison in his office, recording his confession about the mall collapse and the bribes that had covered it up. The recording had sparked a federal investigation that toppled Harrison Development and sent David to prison. The families of the victims finally had their justice. "There's something else," Marcus continued, moving to stand beside her. "The City Planning Committee wants to commission you for the waterfront revitalization project. It's everything you dreamed of before this nightmare started." She turned to face him, studying the man who had become her anchor through the storm. "And what about your dreams? The documentary is finished, isn't it?" His smile was soft, genuine. "Premieres next month at the film festival. But Sarah, building this place with you, watching you refuse to give up even when everything seemed impossible, that changed what I want my future to look like." A gentle breeze stirred the wildflowers Sarah had planted along the cliff's natural ledges, their roots now helping to stabilize the soil just as her engineering plans had predicted. The house itself seemed to breathe with the wind, its design working in harmony with the natural forces that had once threatened to destroy it. Elena's voice called from inside. "Sarah, you need to see this!" They found her standing before the wall-mounted television in the living room, remote in hand. A news anchor was discussing the 1-year anniversary of the mall collapse, but the tone was different now. No longer about mysterious structural failures, but about corporate corruption and the architect who had risked everything to expose the truth. "The Harrison development scandal has led to new federal oversight requirements for construction projects," the anchor continued, "while the innovative cliff house designed by Sarah Chen has become a symbol of architectural integrity and environmental harmony." Elena muted the television. "Your vindication is complete. The professional board voted yesterday to not only reinstate your license, but to commend you for ethical conduct under extreme circumstances." Sarah sank into the handcrafted chair that Marcus had built from reclaimed driftwood, feeling the weight of the past year finally beginning to lift. The house around her felt solid, permanent, a testament to the fact that some things, when built on truth and determination, could indeed last forever. "There's going to be a memorial service next week," she said quietly, "for the victims. I want to attend." Marcus reached for her hand. "We'll go together." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Sarah could see the small garden where she'd started growing vegetables and soil she'd hauled up the cliff one bucket at a time. It had seemed impossible then, just like everything else about this project. Now tomatoes hung heavy on the vine, their roots deep in earth that would have been considered worthless by conventional standards. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Her breath caught as she read it. "Miss Chen, my daughter was one of the victims in the mall collapse. Thank you for making sure the truth came out. Because of you, other families won't have to go through what we did." Tears blurred her vision as she showed the message to Marcus and Elena. In that moment, she understood that the house was more than just a structure defying gravity and engineering convention. It represented something larger, the idea that truth could be built on the most unstable foundations and still stand strong. Elena gathered her things, preparing to return to the city. "You know," she said, pausing at the door, "when I first took your case, I thought we were just fighting for your professional reputation. I didn't realize we were actually fighting for something much more important." "What's that?" Sarah asked. "Proof that integrity isn't just an abstract concept. Sometimes you can actually build it, brick by brick, choice by choice, until it becomes something solid enough to live in." As Elena's car disappeared down the winding road, Sarah and Marcus stood together on their impossible deck, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The house held steady beneath their feet as she had always known it would, built on bedrock deeper than stone, built on truth that would never crumble.